Congratulations to Eddie. That was a great start. This chart indicates what has been happening for the last 20 years. The left-hand side is the Celtic Tiger. The right-hand side, the collapse. Gareth Fitzgerald laid the foundation for the Celtic Tiger with Dukes and Bruton in 1982. And he set good example for the second coming of this gentleman and the continued work of Reynolds, the work of Bruton, and an excellent finance minister, Quinn. And by the time those four prime ministers had done their job, the country was in reasonably good shape, with the highest growth rates seen in Europe year after year. And then our friend arrived. With his colleague, with the most extraordinary policy which undid the work of successive prime ministers. And according to Wikipedia now, is considered the worst minister for finance Europe has had since World War II. He started to spend what he was given by a giveaway budget unseen ever in the history of the country, where taxes were reduced, social welfare was increased, and public spending was outrageously increased. Followed up with a 48% increase in public spending up to 2003. The increase from 300,000 people on the public payroll of 71,000 extra people brought onto the public payroll. In 2000, Ireland was the fourth most competitive country in Europe. By the way, it's about 70,000 people take to run the whole European Union in the Brussels system. We added 70,000. Not only did we add them, in 2000 it cost about 10 billion to run the public sector. If we paid them the consumer price index, today it would cost 12 billion to run the public sector. But no, we paid, the ATM machine was launched, and we paid them 25% more than the consumer price index. And we had 70,000 extra people. And today it costs 19 billion to run the public sector. So 7 billion a year more than when Ireland was the fourth most competitive country in Europe. And then, just as a parting gesture, decentralization was thrown at the system. And our friend went off. Growth looked healthy. But if growth was analysed during those years, it would be seen that real growth associated with manufacturing and exports was constantly dropping. And domestic demand, due to increase in public expenditure and building construction, masked the real decay in our economy, which was commenced around 2001. Private debt in a decade grew from 30 billion to 300 billion. And then we went off to Inchydoney. And this gentleman had a new version of McCreevy. If you have it, I'll spend it. And we increased social welfare payments to 3 times the level they are in Northern Ireland. And we won. The greatest foolish action of Mahern, of course, was to win the 07 election. Normally Fianna Fáil managed to drop out when things are looking fairly bad, but it serves him right. But this is the horrible state of our public finances, where expenditure have gone in one direction and tax in the opposite. It is horrendous. And the hard work which was done since the early 80s, when we were quite a basket case, has been in a few years dissipated. Commercial bank debt is not as bad as in Iceland, but it's 6 times as bad as in the United States. The key issues for recovery: people and talent, competitiveness. If we focus on those 2 issues, we can hope to prepare for recovery. Now, when we had more money than we knew what to do with it, throwing money at problems without thinking was what was done. Education is a wonderful example. There was a 3-fold increase in expenditure in education, and who could argue that that wasn't good? But we didn't change the system. And the World Competitiveness Report shows that after tripling expenditure in education, meeting the needs of the competitive economy in a decade has dropped by 15%. And McKinsey did a report which asked the question, why, if you spend money on education, does the output not improve? A lot of countries had the problem. And he discovered that once expenditure in education reaches a certain level, then that's fine. But the key thing is the quality of those who teach. And if you do not have an elite transferring values and information from one generation to the next, you won't have a very good next generation. And Finland and Canada and Singapore and South Korea have a superb school system because they have superbly good teachers, and not everyone they consider fit to be a teacher. Education was an example of throwing money at a problem and not solving it. Health went even further. We allocated 330% increase of funding to health. And meeting the needs of Irish society, we had a drop of 24% in a decade, World Competitiveness Report. Why? Because we didn't change the system, and we didn't put in managers with courage and all the convictions and qualities that Eddie was talking about. Now, we don't have it, so we can't spend it, so we might think of getting the words right. There's the drop in Irish competitiveness from the year 2000. Let's look at 2 examples that we're dealing with at present. Good policy is made on the basis of fact rather than whimsy or ideology. The good news is that we have an energy infrastructure which is better than Kazakhstan. And we have a Minister for Energy who comes with considerable conviction, and I like people with conviction. But if they have a conviction that is quite daft, it creates problems. Our Minister, because of his conviction, without the basis of any guidance by fact, decided that 40% of our energy should be created by renewables in the year 2020, even though the EU stretch thing was 20%. Wonderfully, 26 billion, to keep him quiet, was allocated to implement his fancy. 4 billion to restructure the electrical grid, which is to build pylons from the west across Donegal and so on for Dublin. And another 22 billion, a deal was done with the ESB to decarbonize the ESB. This is continuing to roll out to keep the Greens happy, even though the demand for electricity has dropped by 17%, and the future that we predicted when the Celtic Tiger was at its height doesn't exist and won't exist. And as a result of this nonsense, Irish electricity prices, which were the European average in the year 2000, are now amongst the highest in Europe. And just on Thursday, you had the multinationals stating that public service levy on all electricity bills to pay for the support for green energy is something that they will strongly resist, and enterprise will move elsewhere if they have to pay this levy. Waste disposal. How can it be that waste disposal in Ireland is twice as expensive as Singapore, where it must be damn difficult to dispose of your waste, are 3 times more expensive than the East Coast in the United States? We have the most expensive waste disposal arrangements in the world. And despite the fact that our minister is peering through his green glasses, He has failed to see an incinerator in Vienna, which is a tourist attraction and a cause for admiration, or the pristine one in Malmö, or the one in Zurich surrounded by the snow, where the Swiss have built 28 incinerators that provide electricity for 250,000 homes and prevent Switzerland from importing this dreadful oil. 200,000 tons of oil are not imported to Switzerland because they burn their rubbish. And here is a minister implementing policies based on his whimsy without the benefit of fact. So policies are defective when policies are not based on fact and based on evidence. And we've had a succession of daft policies for the past decade which have created our difficulties. But the big question is, what were the civil servants doing? Because the role of effective civil servants is to signalise in a yes minister way the daft ideas that people have when they come to office. What was the public service doing for the last decade? What were they doing to Charlie McCreevy when he pronounced, if I have it, I'm going to spend it, and all of the silly gambits that he pursued? The construction incentives when we should have been going in the opposite direction. We were pouring oil on the flames. We had lost control of our currency. What about decentralisation? What were the civil servants doing to derail or sideline that? What were they doing about the crazy tax policies, or the bank regulation, or the benchmarking, or the social welfare policy, or the energy policy, or the waste policy, or labour policy? 25 pieces of labour legislation and 8 regulatory bodies, an additional one put in place by Bertie Ahern at 3 o'clock in the morning each time he had to conclude a national wage agreement. So it has been said recently by politicians, we run the country, not the civil servants. That's ignorance of the law, because the country is run in a partnership between the elected officials and the civil servants. Government efficiency has gone in this direction. Mismanagement of state agencies. We have 188 national non-commercial state agencies. These happen to have 2,300 board members. And I, when I was running the University of Limerick and the NIHE before it, on occasion would be afflicted. On occasion, thoughtful ministers gave me good board members. But as often as not, I got people from Longford and Castletownbere and the extremities of the country to optimise their expenses. And the only interest most of them had was the expense form and lunch. And they were a liability which taxed the resources of the executive. Now, how can we can very quickly alter this by doing what other countries do. An independent commission. It draws up lists of experts in transport or education or health and so on, and the minister makes the choice, but only from a list. And that could be done in the morning, and instantly the 200 state agencies would have decent leadership. The civil service has been weakened. The answer, why haven't they been doing something? But the civil service has been weakened either by default or by intention. The quality of the recruitment during the last 2 decades has been affected by the fact that people, the smartest, have not gone into the public service, they've gone into the private sector. Political advisors have acted as a cocoon around ministers that in some cases have isolated the minister from the professional advice of the public servants. And political advisors are all about the next election and the party. And there is a certain minister who ignores totally his senior civil servants and is guided by these people. Decentralisation was, as Eddie so wonderfully stated, I can't get the magic words you used, Eddie, but it dissipated the energies, it distracted the public servants, corporate memory was lost. One department secretary general found 40 replacements. And was it you had this? I think there were 60, in fact, Eddie. And he said that his core was dissipated. Those who came in couldn't do the job, and they were at an age where they had no interest in learning. Public Service Management Act, which was fairly good, had one flaw, that it provides the opportunity for a minister who's faced down by a Secretary General to be hung out and dried. And so you've had a docile civil service since then. And Haughey, terrified, good Secretaries General. And the attitudes emerged, whether the minister is right or wrong, go along with it. And that thoughtful sidelining of crazy ideas tended to be less effective. And less confident Department of Finance. Gareth, I think you mentioned at one time there were 20 economists in the Department of Finance, now there's one. So the expertise has been denuded, and you have a generalist trying to do the best job they could. So we need full reform of the civil service, a la New Zealand or Hong Kong. We need Secretary Generals with clear legal means for intercepting daft ministerial initiatives. And we need to beef up the specialist expertise of the Department of Finance. We need, as Eddie was saying, we didn't collaborate on this, we need to reverse decentralisation. I was classified in the Dáil by Bertie Ahern as a Gombeen man because I came from Limerick and was saying decentralisation was daft. I have that honour. And limit the intrusion of political advisors. But the greatest talent deficit is at the very top in the Cabinet. We have no distinguished business leader in the Cabinet. We have only one with a business qualification, a BCom from UCD. If it was from Limerick, it might even be a bit better. Only one scientifically person is literate, there's a BSc degree. So we have a cabinet, 6 teachers, 1 lecturer, 1 guidance counsellor, 1 social worker, 3 lawyers, 3 business people. O'Keefe has the best of the business expertise. He managed a co-op in the Gaeltacht. Ryan ran a bicycle shop and a tour business, and Gormley ran a language school. The cabinet, a well-intentioned, hard-working but undistinguished group of people who, if they constituted the board of a company, would be unlikely to secure the confidence of potential investors or be taken very seriously. And I have introduced a run-a-sweet shop rating where you get 10 points if you have managed anything and 5 points if you're self-employed. The government get 30%, Fine Gael 38%, unchanged, precisely the same number with the new front bench and Labour. But the Labour are the most scientifically literate. The Standing Committee of the Chinese Politburo, 100% are scientifically literate. So the solution, introduce mechanisms whereby movers and shakers and people of proven talent are brought into cabinet. Co-op, the simplest way, it's possible, Gareth, you brought in Jim Jukes. Co-option, it's still possible to bring in 2 people. And could you imagine how the cabinet discussion would change if Jim O'Hara, the head of Intel, and Peter Sutherland were members of cabinet? Imagine if you had 6 of them. We could do this immediately with a minor constitutional amendment, and I don't think people would object to have 6 members co-opted from outside. Or if you want to introduce the list system, which is long-haul arrangement, that would do it likewise. The list system, by the way, our closest neighbour has the first past the poll. Malta and ourselves are the only countries in the world with the STV system. All of the green countries have introduced some form of list system, so that capable movers and shakers in society are in one way or other are introduced into cabinet. I'll read this bit finally to you. The IMF advisors last month stated that fiscal austerity combined with structural reform would provide for greater prospects of recovery than fiscal austerity alone. We're talking about fiscal austerity. We need that. But structural reform must take place. It costs no money. All it requires is the will and the character and the wit to do it. Ireland is in the gravest danger of economic and social disintegration since the foundation of the state. And I suspect this time next year, if we can get here, Ireland will be in great disarray. Structural reform of Ireland's antiquated and ineffective legislature, executive and public service is no longer optional. It is both as urgent as it is essential for recovery. And may I suggest, as I think Eddie was also, that a small group be drawn from this week's meeting to constitute a core of a National Assembly of citizens with a mandate to draw up by the 31st of October a plan for the fundamental reform of the administration and governance of this republic and call an assembly of citizens symbolically in the Mansion House. We need a second republic. The quality of governance cannot exceed the quality of those who govern.